social care and the challenge that we face, but I do want to just first of all highlight a real concern that other honourable members have expressed, and that is that the funding constraints on local government have had a very big impact on services that are there for preventive purposes, services that are designed to stop extra costs being incurred at a later stage through the failure of the system. And I wanted to just give one or two examples. We've recently conducted an inquiry on the Science and Technology Select Committee into the impact of adversity in childhood. This is trauma, abuse or neglect, particularly in early years. And we know that if we intervene early, if we follow the evidence of what is effective in stopping that trauma becoming entrenched, then we can transform lives, but we can also save a fortune further down the track. And the honourable member opposite talked about the Conservative Party being the custodians of careful finance or something. But actually what we're seeing is very significant reductions in investment in preventive services, which end up costing the state a fortune further down the line. Children who experience trauma, abuse or neglect in early years, who don't get the support that they need, too often end up being excluded from school, and then the track through to the criminal justice system is all too real. Educational attainment is often lower, therefore, than it should be. Worklessness often follows. And so what we have seen over the last few years, disinvestment in those preventive services in early years, supporting parents, etc., has been a very stupid thing to do because it will cost the state far more in years to come. And the Chancellor encouragingly, in a moment, the Chancellor encouragingly, when he launched the budget a few weeks ago, said that he was willing to invest in early intervention where there was evidence of its effectiveness. Well, there is evidence of its effectiveness, but the Chancellor therefore needs to make that investment. I give way.
I'm very grateful to him giving way, and I have huge respect for his knowledge in this area. But he's talking about overall local government spending cuts. And of course, he was a part of the first 5 years of this government with the coalition, where we saw the greatest amount of austerity of local government funding cuts under a Liberal Democrat and Tory coalition. So does he regret his part in the huge cuts to local government we saw between 2010 and 2015?
I think actually, if we're honest, every government has some responsibility here. The reductions started before 2010. I absolutely accept. Let me address this point. I'm trying to be straight with him. I think mistakes were made during the coalition government in terms of the hit that local government took during that period. If you look at the contrast between supporting the NHS and increasing in real terms investment in the NHS, but the cut that happened to social care, that doesn't make sense, but that's what happened. And I recognise that. It was above my pay grade, but I don't think it was the right decision to make. And I hope that's of some help to him.
No consolation.
I will.
My honourable friend has made some really important points about the first 1,000 days of life, but equally there are similar arguments at the end of life, where, for example, too many people who need social care end up in a much more expensive place at the end of their life where they don't want to be in a hospital setting for the want of the right investment in social care. Would he agree that we should apply that principle of investing to save across the whole life course?
I would absolutely recognise and accept that point. And just going back to the honourable member who intervened to challenge the point about spending under coalition, there was a crisis in public finances in 2010, which did have to be addressed. But I do accept that the balance between social care and the NHS wasn't optimal. But I also wanted to address other areas where the underinvestment or disinvestment in preventive services has borne a heavy cost. So the honourable member for Lewisham and Deptford, who's done very good work on youth violence, and I've been part of the Commission looking at that, made the point that many of the preventive services that are there, particularly during youth years, teenage years, to stop a risk of slipping into gang violence, have been stripped away in many of these poorest communities. And again, the impact of that has been, and it's very hard to judge cause and effect in these things, but the impact in part has been an increase in violence on our streets at awful and dreadful cost to many of those who are affected by it. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I wanted to turn specifically to social care, and it's worth just reflecting for a moment on why social care is so important. It's there to give people the chance of a happy life, of a good life, as far as it's able to enjoy a good life if you are struggling with a range of conditions. It's there to help people to remain independent in old age, to support people so that they don't end up needing the NHS at enormous impact on their well-being. And one of the problems we face is that unless you or a family member actually experiences the need for social care, it's hidden from view. So very many families across our country simply don't see what the impact is of the underfunding of social care today. But it is very real, and there are over 1 million older people who are not getting the care that they need. And as Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of the NHS, has pointed out on many occasions, if people aren't getting support in social care, it has an impact then on the NHS, and the settlement, the funding settlement for the NHS simply will not work unless we address the under-resourcing of social care.
Will you just get well on that point?
I will.
He knows more about social care than anyone else in this House. I pay that compliment. Would you accept one of the most unfair elements of this is where in the past local authorities have moved people out with learning disabilities to cheaper parts of the country, Gloucestershire being a classic case of that, and then those people's care needs get worse over time, and a local authority that moved them out says it's not our problem, it's the problem of the local authority to which they've moved. That's why we need a national care service. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely right to highlight the issue of how we care for people of a younger age who have care needs, particularly those with learning disability and with autism. And what too often happens is those people end up in institutions when they don't need to be there, often away from home, at enormous cost to the public purse. And again, the evidence from around the country shows that where they do it well and support families to keep someone at home, helping them through crises, you reduce the cost of the public purse, but you have a massive impact on their well-being. And he's right also to highlight the fact that you end up with awful disputes about who's responsible for payment as people are shunted around the country in a way that fundamentally breaches their human rights, in my view.
I'm glad, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Right Honourable members are now talking on this topic. I think it's an absolutely vital thing. But does he regret the extent to which the Transforming Care programme now seems to have been abandoned by the government? There seems to be no future for it. So where, I think from the time when he was a minister, there was a programme to deal with the issue that my honourable friend has just raised. There now appears to be an abandonment of targets, an abandonment of a future for that programme, and certainly no funding to make it work.
Well, I'm deeply concerned about the future or lack of future of the Transforming Care programme. And one of the problems, of course, is that it's often NHS England who are funding care in an institution. And when a local authority is under financial stress, there's not much of an incentive to take that person out of the institution and make them the responsibility of the local authority. And there has to be a way of funding a building of the infrastructure to support people in the community, and that's what has failed to happen so far. But I also wanted to make the point that this is not a static issue that we face. There is a growing pressure here. We are all living longer. We're often living with chronic conditions that in the past used to kill us. And that's a great triumph of man and womankind, but there is a cost attached to it. And yet we are simply not, we have no mechanism to address the increasing funding needs of social care, and in particular dementia. Now, the Honourable Member for Chelmsford, one of the valued members of the Science and Technology Select Committee, made the point that the cost to society of dementia is about £26 billion every year. But this is going to rise dramatically. So whatever we say about spending money efficiently, and I completely agree with the need to spend money efficiently and to innovate and to do things in a more effective way, just the rising demand, this dramatic rise in demand, inevitably means that we're going to have to spend more as a society on supporting people with dementia, and also to spend more money on research to find cures for dementia. I will give way very briefly, but I'm having glows at me from the Deputy Chair.
Would he agree with me that one of the ways of supporting people who need care, such as dementia sufferers, is to support their carers? And there is a very important role for organisations like the Sutton Carers Centre in providing that support to the network of carers who operate and support people with dementia and others with long-term conditions.
I very much agree with that, and those organisations do incredibly important work. I wanted to mention the Care Act. I was responsible for taking the Care Act through Parliament. I think it was widely regarded as good legislation, but I fear that it has been undermined by a failure to commit sufficient resources to really realise the transformation that the Care Act was designed to achieve in personalising care, in putting the individual at the heart of everything that local authorities do. And in particular, we legislated for a cap on care costs in the Care Act. And as soon as the Conservatives got rid of the Lib Dems out of the coalition, that commitment was abandoned. And so all the work we did in consulting, in legislating for a cap on care costs to protect people from catastrophic cost has been lost. And of course, what we know is that in the middle of the general election in 2017, the Prime Minister paid dearly politically for that because the replacement proposal was sorely lacking and amounted, in many people's eyes, to a tax on dementia. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious you want me to shut up very soon, but I just wanted to say something very briefly on the future funding. We have to work, it seems to me, if we are to achieve a sustainable settlement, we have to work on a cross-party basis. The government has to embrace that. The motion does still beg the question about where the money is going to come from. It doesn't answer that question. And there are a range of solutions. I have proposed, as indeed my party has proposed, that we should have a dedicated health and care tax shown on your pay packet so everyone can see where the money is going, informed by an assessment, an independent assessment, perhaps every 5 years, of how much the health and care system needs, to take the politics out of the calculation of how much the care system needs. Then the parties can argue about whether they're prepared to meet that through an increase in that dedicated tax. But if we are to solve this, it requires political will. And the truth, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that there has been a failure of the political class, not just in the last few years, but ever since the late 90s, when when a Royal Commission from the then Labour government came up with proposals which was never implemented, and ever since then it's been pushed in and out of the long grass, and we are still waiting for a solution, and it is time that we reach a solution because we are letting too many people down in our country.
I'm just bothered that we have a lot of speakers and we're working on 10 minutes. If members are going to go over it, we're going to affect people who are lower down the order. So please, can we try and help each other? Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, who we all know has great knowledge in this area.